we have been discussing about the discipline-specific core paper, Introduction to Philosophy, which has been introduced to Semester 1 students from the Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi. We further engage with the themes that comes under this paper. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Today, the question that we would be delving in is the question of existence. Now, the learning objectives of today's lecture would be that students should be in a position by then to be able to understand why the question of existence is a philosophical problem, not a simple fact. Also, the explanation, the movement from ontology or being to epistemology, knowing, would be the other contribution. Identifying the methods philosophy uses to examine existence claims will be the other learning objective. Also, attempt would be made to relate Western philosophical methods to Indian philosophical traditions. Now, when we try to introduce the problem, we begin with the question. For example, when we say something exists, what exactly are we claiming? This philosophy does not start by accepting existence as obvious. It asks, how is existence defined? How is existence justified and argued? So, basically, existence is all about being, then going on to knowing, and then to method. So, in a way, we are emphasizing that this is a methodological progression, not three separate topics: being, knowledge, and method. Now, what is being? Being is the ontological framing. At this juncture, philosophy asks, what kinds of things exists? Are all things equally real? Does existence depend on the mind? The method used would be something what we call as ontological analysis. For example, philosophy classifies entities, objects, minds, numbers, values. It asks what kind of existence each has. Examples for students: physical objects like table, tree; abstract objects, numbers, time; experiential objects, dreams, emotions. And if we try to see, we see the connection with Indian philosophy, where Sat is that which truly exists, Asat is that which does not, and Mithya, the concept in Advaita, is that which appears real but is not ultimately real. So, what we are emphasizing here is ontological claims are theoretical, not merely observational. Now that the being part has been framed, we move to stage 2, which is the epistemological scrutiny, the knowing part. Once existence is claimed, philosophy asks, how do we know this exists? The method here used is epistemic evaluation. We explain this via examining sources of belief like perception, reason, testimony, or we question their reliability. We also come up with certain skeptical challenges at this juncture, like illusions and dreams, possibility of error, brain in a vat thought experiment. Similarly, in Indian parallel, the ignorance or avidya explains false beliefs, pramanas, tests valid knowledge. So, philosophy does not reject existence claims outright, it tests them. Then comes stage 3. Stage 3 is the philosophical method proper. How philosophy handles conflict between being and knowing. This is the core methodological section. We must understand that philosophy clarifies concepts before answering questions. Many debates arise from unclear meanings. Example, is existence a property? Here, Immanuel Kant would say something like existence is not a predicate. Similarly, in Indian parallel in Advaita Vedanta, we would see things like existence is not a property of objects but of Brahman. Further, there is the thought experiment. Thought experiment tests intuitions under controlled conditions. They do not provide facts but reveal assumptions. Examples, brain in a vat, dream argument, Buddhistic chariot analogy. The purpose is to show limits of perception and language. Then comes the stage of argumentation and debate. Now, philosophy advances through arguments and counter-arguments. The claims must be defended logically. Structures to teach should be firstly state a claim, give reasons, consider objections, refine the position. In Indian parallel, it is what is called as Vada or the structured philosophical debate. Then there is also the segment which is the levels of reality and context. When contradictions persist, philosophy introduces levels of reality, context-sensitive truth, for example, empirical versus ultimate reality of Advaita, conventional versus ultimate truth of Buddhism, common sense versus philosophical skepticism, like Pritchard. So this avoids both blind realism and total skepticism. Now, why is it that this methodology, which is critical emphasis, important? Philosophy does not give final answers like science. It aims at clarity, coherence, and rational responsibility. The method ensures existence claims are not dogmatic, knowledge claims are justified, disagreement remains productive. Thus, the philosophical question of existence moves from identifying what is claimed to existence to examining how such claims are known and finally to analyzing how these claims are argued and justified through philosophical method. So, what the question of existence really is at a deeper level, the question of existence is not simply does X exist. It is a three-layered philosophical problem. Ontological layer, what counts as being? Are all existence of the same kind? Is existence a property, a relation, or a condition? Most confusion, as we had said, arises because we assume one flat notion of existence, whereas philosophy shows plurality of modes of being. Miller helps us see the existence claims carry ontological commitments. Advaita clarifies this through levels of reality like the Pramarthika versus the Vyavaharika. Buddhism dissolves the problem by rejecting intrinsic being altogether. So the problem is not a lack of answers but excess of unexamined assumptions. Now, when we come to the epistemic layer, which is the second layer, the question that revolves around is how do we justify existence claims? Even if something exists, do we know it directly or only through inference, language, or social practices? The critical tension then is that metaphysics asserts existence, epistemology keeps asking on what grounds, Pritchard's skepticism shows our access to reality is mediated, fallible, and revisable. Indian philosophy names this problem avidya, structural ignorance, not mere error. So the question of existence becomes, is the problem reality or our way of knowing it. The third is the methodological layer, how philosophy approaches existence. Philosophy does not resolve existence by mere observation, like science or authority alone, religion. Instead, it uses conceptual clarification, logical argument, and critical doubt. So, existence is not discovered, it is philosophically negotiated. This is why disagreements persist and why philosophy remains relevant. Further, about the question of existence, why is it so difficult? The question of existence is hard because language misleads us. Grammar suggests that naming implies existence. Nothing exists already treats nothing as something. Experience overreaches. What appears real is assumed to be real. Both skepticism and Buddhism challenge this leap. Metaphysics and epistemology puts in opposite directions. Metaphysics wants commitment. Epistemology wants caution. So the problem is not choosing between realism and anti-realism, but learning to hold them in productive tension. So how do we then tackle the question philosophically? A practical strategy would be, firstly, step 1, clarify the sense of existence. Ask, is the existence independent or dependent? Is it ultimate or empirical? Is it conceptual or material? This immediately avoids category mistakes. Step 2, separate ontology from epistemology. Students often collapse what exists with what we can know exists, or good philosophy keeps them distinct but connected. And step 3 is use comparative philosophy as a critical tool. Indian philosophy is not an addition but a diagnostic lens. Advaita shows how realism can coexist with appearance. Buddhism shows how dissolving a sense dissolves the problem. Nyaya reminds us that realism needs epistemic instruments, pramana. So this pluralism prevents dogmatism. Step 4, accept incompleteness as philosophical maturity. A crucial insight for students especially is to remember that philosophy does not aim at final answers but a better question and clearer positions. The question of existence remains open by design, not by failure. So the question of existence is not merely about whether things exist, but about how existence is to be understood, justified, and philosophically articulated. Metaphysics, as shown by Christy Miller, reveals that existence involves ontological commitments and levels of reality, while epistemology, as discussed by Duncan Pritchard, exposes the fragility of our claims to knowledge. Indian philosophical traditions deepen this inquiry by distinguishing between appearance and reality, or by rejecting intrinsic existence altogether. Critically approached, the problem of existence is best tackled not by choosing a single doctrine, but by clarifying concepts, separating ontology from epistemology, and remaining open to plural and provisional understandings of being. So being followed by knowing, followed by philosophical method. Now, we must understand that what is the question of existence really about and how do we tackle it quickly. Christy Miller would say then what is metaphysics, Duncan Pritchard what is knowledge, and further something like what is this thing called philosophy, the references that we would be referring. Now, if we look at the PPT that is being displayed here, we would see that the conceptual map, how the three exist, talks to each other. question of what exists. If we talk about the discipline metaphysics, the core text is Christy Miller. Now, if we talk about what does it mean to know that something exists, is clearly the discipline of epistemology, and the core text would be Pritchard's What is Knowledge. Further, if we talk about how do philosophers ask and justify such questions, is the domain of philosophy as a method, and the core text is this thing called Philosophy by Pritchard. So the question of existence is not isolated. It moves from being, metaphysics, knowing, epistemology, and philosophical method. So discussing the question of existence, we see that metaphysics, to begin with, it is what does it mean to exist, what exists. Christy Miller explains that metaphysics is concerned with the most fundamental structure of reality. The question of existence is therefore not merely whether something is real, but what kinds of things exist. What does it mean to be? Are there different modes of existence? Similarly, there could be key metaphysical distinctions one should be aware of, like concrete versus abstract objects. Concrete, such as tables, trees, bodies; abstract, like numbers, properties, relations, time. So, do numbers exist in the same way as tables? There is also the concept of realism versus anti-realism. Realism is, the world exists independently of our minds. Anti-realism, existence depends in some way on human practices, language, or conceptual schemes. There is also this ontological commitment. To say X exists is to commit oneself to a certain ontology. For example, if you say there are moral facts, you are committed to moral realism. Now, someone like Miller would say that metaphysics asks what must be, the world be like for our theories, language, and experience to be true. In the same breath, if we talk about Duncan Pritchard's epistemology, how do we know about existence? What is knowledge? Now, once existence is posed metaphysically, epistemology steps in with a second-order question. Even if something exists, how can we know it exists? Pritchard frames knowledge as traditionally justified true belief, but shows why this is insufficient. So, perceptual knowledge, for example, we believe physical objects exist because we perceive them, but perception can mislead, hallucinations, illusions, dreams. Skepticism, where the classic skeptical challenges, brain in a vat, evil demon. So these raises doubts about whether we know that the external world exists. Now, the question is the origin of epistemology. Why epistemology emerged later than metaphysics? Epistemology arises when philosophers ask, how can we be sure that our metaphysical claims are true? Thus, epistemology is reflective, critical, second order. It becomes urgent when skepticism arises, scientific method develops, religious authority is questioned. Now, anti-skeptical strategies, Pritchard discusses common sense realism, contextualism, virtue epistemology, and we see that metaphysics may say what exists. Epistemology asks whether our belief in its existence is justified. So, philosophy as a method, how our existence questions frame, we see that Pritchard's What is this thing called philosophy, this particular text helps students understand how philosophers even approach the question of existence. Some of the philosophical methods relevant here are conceptual analysis. What do we mean by existence? Is existence a property, as Kant debated? There also could be thought experiments like brain in a vat, possible worlds, zombies, which is relevant to the existence of mind, or arguments and counter-arguments. where philosophy progresses through reasoned disagreement, not experiments alone. Pritchard emphasizes that philosophy does not merely collect facts but clarifies concepts, examines assumptions, and tests the limits of reason. So, the question what exists is philosophical because it is not settled by observation alone. It requires conceptual clarity and logical justification. And what is this integrated structure for teaching, or we find that the integrated structure for the very question of existence lies at the heart of philosophy, connecting metaphysics and epistemology. While metaphysics investigates what exists, epistemology examines how we know that something exists. Drawing on Christy Miller's and Duncan Pritchard's, this unit explores existence as both an ontological and epistemic problem. Further, metaphysics examines the fundamental nature of reality, including distinctions between abstract and concrete entities, realism and anti-realism, and ontological commitment. Miller shows that asking what exists involves understanding the structure of reality itself. So, philosophers or epistemologists like Pritchard's discussion of knowledge introduces skeptical challenge to our claims about existence. Even if metaphysics posits a mind-independent world, epistemology must explain how such knowledge is justified in the face of error and doubt. So, philosophy approaches existence through conceptual analysis, argumentation, and thought experiments. Unlike empirical sciences, philosophical inquiry evaluates the meaning and justification of existence claims. Thus, the question of existence emerges as a deeply interconnected philosophical problem requiring both metaphysical accounts of reality and epistemological accounts of knowledge grounded in rigorous philosophical method. Thus, in philosophy, the question of existence asks what is real and what sense something can be said to exist. This question has been central to metaphysics, while epistemology asks how we know that something exists. And so, as we had said, Miller explains that metaphysics studies the basic structure of reality, and philosophers ask, do only physical objects exist? Do abstract entities like numbers, time, and properties exist? Is reality independent of the human mind? We had also seen the parallel with Satchidanand, or rather Sat and Asat, where Sat is that from the Indian parallel which truly exists, unchanging, real. Asat is that which does not exist or is impermanent or illusory. This parallels Western metaphysics, where philosophers distinguish between fundamental reality and appearance or dependent reality. Similarly, with Advaita Vedanta and realism, we see that Advaita Vedanta holds that Brahman alone is Sat, ultimately real. The world is mithya, neither fully real nor unreal. This resembles metaphysical realism at the ultimate level, anti-realism at the empirical level. Miller's discussion of levels of reality and ontological commitment helps students understand how something can exist without being ultimately real. So, the question then, how do we know what exists? We had just about mentioned. Pritchard discusses knowledge as traditionally understood JTB, or justified true belief, and explains skeptical challenges which is to do with the illusion, the dream argument, the brain in a vat, and these raise doubts about whether we can know that the external world exists. And in Indian parallel, about avidya or ignorance, ignorance causes us to mistake appearance for reality, like a rope in the dark might be mistaken as a snake. So knowledge or jnana removes ignorance and reveals true existence. Thus, epistemology in both traditions deals with error, doubt, and conditions of genuine knowledge. Similarly, with Buddhist philosophy and emptiness, the shunyata, we see Buddhism challenges the idea of permanent existence. They say all things are dependent, the pratitya samutpada theory. Nothing has svabhava, the self-existence. This parallels Western anti-realist and the deflationary ontologies, where existence is relational rather than absolute. We will be talking more about the philosophy as a method in our next lecture, and we will try to continue and connect epistemology and metaphysics here. Thank you so much.